all your good conversation. Ando Mitsumasa is best known for his children's books. I was fortunate enough to translate the first book that he published in English. Later in his career, he got interested in Japanese history, and his interest in Japanese history resulted in an illustrated version of The Tale of Heike, the sort of political novel about the turmoils in Japan between 1150 and 1200, and part of those turmoils resulted in the burnings of Todaiji and Kofukuji, burnings of the two great temples of Nara. And so I begin with an Ano Mitsumasa photograph of the burning of the Great Buddha Hall. We don't have Kofukuji in this, but the same fires that burned Todaiji burned Kofukuji. There were competing factions in Japan in the second half of the 12th century. We think of Buddhist monks as being peace-loving. The Buddhist temples of Japan had standing armies. Kofukuji had a standing army. Kofukuji was exceedingly sort of intolerant of the government in Kyoto's views towards it and its affiliated temples. And so the warlord at the time, Taira no Kiyomori, sent his son down to punish the monks of Kofukuji. A fire was set north of the city. The fire burned down into the city, destroyed most of Todaiji. It essentially destroyed all of Kofukuji. And so the dry lacquer statues at the temple today, the two dry lacquer statues, I was told I was wrong, they're not upstairs, they're on this floor. The dry lacquer statues in the collection of the Asian Art Museum were saved from that conflagration. One of the things about dry lacquer sculpture is that it's exceedingly light, it's exceedingly portable. And so you can imagine, as the temple buildings are burning, monks rushing in and saving these remarkable treasures. So the temples, almost immediately it was planned to rebuild the temples. The Fujiwara family saw Kofukuji as the most crucial temple in their sort of family history that sort of preserved their authority, even though Nara was somewhat of a forgotten place in the 12th and 13th centuries. The new warlord, Minamoto no Yoritomo, and the government at the time felt that Todaiji was the most important symbol of Japan's support of Buddhism, and that Todaiji sort of functioned as a protecting entity of Buddhism. And so plans were made for Todaiji to be reconstructed as well. Central to this, I'll jump forward briefly and then go backward. Central to this process are a group of sculptors who modern historians call the Kei School. They call them the Kei School because the founder of the school, whose name you see up there in yellow, Kokei, has Kei in his name, and so most of his successors, whether they are his direct successors or his disciples, took either the character Kei or the character Ko as part of their name. And these sculptors were crucial in the reconstruction of Kofukuji and the reconstruction of Todaiji. I want to show you this object because I think it gives you some sense of just how traumatic the destruction of Todaiji and Kofukuji were to this group of artists. This was a lineage of artists whose predecessors at the end of the 11th century had moved from Kyoto to Nara. These are artists who spent much of their careers, so this lineage spent much of their careers doing repairs on the Nara temples. Halls were burning all the time. There was always something to do. And so you have a group of a lineage of sculptors whose primary association is with Kofukuji. They call themselves Buddhist sculptors or Buddhist masters of Kofukuji. Sometimes they would use Kofukuji's earliest name, Yamashina-dera, and call themselves Buddhist masters of Yamashina-dera. But this group of sculptors, the Kei school, were particularly then associated with the Fujiwara temple, particularly associated with Kofukuji. But Todaiji was also exceedingly meaningful to them as well. And so when the temple burns in 1180, the Kei school sculptors got together along with other adherents, and they commissioned a set of the Lotus Sutra. And when they commissioned the set of the Lotus Sutra, as you all know, narrative hand scrolls have a wooden roller in them. When they commissioned the set of the Lotus Sutra, they used charred timbers from the great Buddha Hall as the wooden roller for those sutras. So what I show you here then is just a section of one of those sutras. And you can see the wooden roller, but they're choosing an object that can't be seen when it's rolled up, but they're choosing an object that has this sort of profound resonance for them. That the great temples of the 8th century, the temples that they had spent their careers working in and around, were no longer there. And they got monks and they got other members of the religious community to join them in this commission. And part of this inscription talks about how when they were making the ink for to transcribe the texts, because they all participated in the transcription, they went to famous temples in and around Nara and got water from wells at those famous temples. And they would write a character and prostrate themselves, and write another character and prostrate themselves. So this was not a simple act of copying. This was an incredible emotional moment for these monks. And Kokei had two chief disciples, his blood disciple, his son, Unkei, and Unkei is the monk who starts this commission. And he has a chief disciple that should be dated 1183, not 1883, I'm sorry. And he had a chief disciple, sort of Unkei's fellow disciple, who was not related by blood, named Kaikei, and Kaikei's name appears in this inscription as well. So this group of sculptors, Kokei, his son Unkei, his fellow disciple Kaikei, Jokei, and then Unkei's sons, these are all sort of the central players in the reconstruction of the temples in Nara. There were other sculptors as well. There were two schools of sculptors in Kyoto. And the Fujiwara family initially gave the commissions to, they shared the commissions. They gave the commission of the main image hall to one of the Kyoto schools. They gave the commission of the lecture hall to another one of the Kyoto schools. And they gave the commission of the South Octagonal Hall to Kokei. But over time, the Kyoto schools sort of went back to Kyoto, and the Fujiwara family increasingly relied on Kei school sculptors to do work at Kofukuji. And so we have works by Kokei, we have works by Unkei, we have works by Kaikei, Jokei. I want to show you some of the kinds of works that they replaced, that they used to replace these sculptures that disappeared. So we're back in the Kofukuji temple complex. You have to imagine no buildings remaining whatsoever. And you have to imagine the Fujiwara family, insisting that this sacred center of their devotion to the Buddhist faith be rebuilt as quickly as possible. Kaikei in 1189 rebuilds or sculpts a statue of the Bodhisattva of the future, the Bodhisattva who is going to be the next Buddha, Miroku. This is yet another one of the statues that is sold in 1905 or 1906. We see it in the same photograph that I showed you just a moment ago. This is a statue that has made its way to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And if you go to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, you can see the statue. We see it here in an early photograph This image, in fact, was not particularly badly damaged, so it's a bit unclear why this image was included in the group. Here we see the image as it has been restored. It was re-gilded, and inside this image, and I'm going to talk at the very end of today's talk about things that are put inside of statues. Inside this statue was a Buddhist Sutra, and Kaike signs that Buddhist Sutra, so we can attribute this image to Kaike. I also put this up because something interesting happens at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century in Buddhist sculpture as well. Buddhist sculptors start signing their images. And it is the Kei school sculptors, it is these sculptors in Nara in particular, who start this process of signing images. So we have a kind of ownership of making imagery that we don't have before. Before we have names associated with statues, and we have textual evidence that allows us to say, this artist made this image. But we don't have, except in truly rare cases, we don't have artists signing their work. Suddenly, as part of this restoration process, and beginning a little bit earlier, we have artists who are aware of the fact that they are artists. Kaike often signed his name skillful artisan Kaike. Essentially saying, I have talent and I'm exercising that talent on behalf of the Buddhist faith. I think this is a really monumental change, and this monumental change I don't think is completely unrelated to the deep emotional attachment this group of sculptors has for the Nara temples, and it is sort of pushed even further forward by their work in restoring Todaiji and Kofukuji in particular. So the first place I want to take you is the South Octagonal Hall. The South Octagonal Hall is given over to the founder of this school. It's given over to Koke. Koke then is entrusted with refurbishing the hall with statues. This hall was originally built in 813. It burns in 1180, of course. It burns again in 1717 when the West Octagonal Hall, when the West Image Hall that housed the Bonten and Taishakuten burned. But for whatever reason, the statues in the South Octagonal Hall, the reconstructed statues, they have been saved on multiple occasions. So we have the entire group of images that Koke sculpts for the South Octagonal Hall, completing this project in 1189. I think part of the reason is that this memorial chapel seems to have been the most important building for the Fujiwara family at Kofukuji. No one who was not a member of the Fujiwara family was allowed inside this building, even though this building became a popular pilgrimage site later in its history. So this is sort of the special place for the Fujiwaras. We have the main image. This is an image of a bodhisattva who holds a noose, and the noose is said to be never empty. So an image of a Buddhist deity who is completely committed to saving all sentient beings. And we know by looking at extant documents that Koke, when he sculpted this image in 1189, looked back to earlier drawings of the original statue, so he could incorporate as much of the original into this work. And one of the things that, as we see in the Bonten and Taishakuten, that we see in the statues of the 10 great disciples in the 8th century, is an interest in naturalism. And so even though the rules, even though the iconography for a bodhisattva is relatively fixed, Koke is interested in recovering some of that naturalism in this image. And an increasing interest in naturalism is one of the characteristics of the Kei school of sculptors. And I think we can see that naturalism most clearly in a group of attendants to the image of the Bodhisattva. In this hole were portraits of 6 monks who were associated with a particular group of Buddhist teachings known as consciousness only, that had been popular at Kofukuji in the 8th century and had become a kind of individual sect later in Kofukuji's early history. So part of this restoration project was restoring imaginary portraits of 6 patriarchs of these consciousness-only teachings. Here we see Zenju, one of those patriarchs. And here too, I think we see a 12th century sculptor thinking about the portraits from the earlier period and sort of refashioning those portraits into a new idiom. In the case of Koke, he is working in wood. He is not working in dry lacquer. And so he is using a reductive process rather than an additive process. And one of the things that the K-school sculptors do to heighten the naturalism of their images is to use rock crystal for the eyes of many of their statues. This is an invention in Japan. I'll talk about it in just a moment. It's an invention in Japan. Japanese Buddhist sculpture is the only tradition that uses these inlaid rock crystal eyes. And I think you get a sense then that we're looking not at an inanimate object, but we're looking at an object that is animated by rock crystal in the eyes that receives and reflects light. It totally changes the nature of the image, along with the naturalism of the facial expression, along with the increased plasticity of the robes, the way the robes are carved to look like real cloth. So we can compare another one of these patriarchs, Genpin, with one of the disciples from Kofukuji. And I think in this case you can see clearly Koke was aware of these 8th century precedents. I think one of the most remarkable ones is the monk, the portrait of this, or imaginary portrait of this monk Gyoga. We see the veins on his head. We see the furrows in his brow. We see the lines in his lips. Koke is certainly aware of the human form. And Koke has the ability of translating that observation of the human form into wood. Koke is aware of posture, I think, in ways that many sculptors since the 8th century really had not been. And so we see this monk seated with his one leg raised. He's holding a long-handled censer, as you see here on the screen. He is gesturing to us, the audience. And just as the 8th century portraits affect our world, engage us in a particular way, I think these portraits engage us as well. To bring this story into or associate it with objects in the collection of the Asian Art Museum, I show on the left-hand side an image that was sort of the standard image in the middle decades of the 12th century, an image that my wife and I were very fortunate to have been able to borrow for an exhibition that we did in the late 90s on Buddhist art and ritual at a museum in Katona, New York, and at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This was the image, the standard image of the Buddha entering into 1150. A seated image in meditation, an image with sort of perfect proportions, a very sort of idealized and distant image. What we know happens is that in at least 1151, because this image on the screen on the right-hand side is dated, in 1151, an artist in Nara decides to do something different. And these are sort of the stories of Buddhist sculpture that make what I do, I think, so incredibly exciting. This artist in Nara decides that this style, while wonderful, he wants to do something different with the style. And what he does different with the style in particular is to inlay the eyes with rock crystal. So this is a Nara invention. We don't know who made this image on the right-hand side. We think it is probably Kokei's immediate predecessor. But we have an artist who is thinking about how to make an image different. And he does that by putting rock crystal in the eyes of his Buddha. So otherwise, if we back up, I think you can say that the image on the right more or less follows the idiom of the image on the left. There are a few differences. There are more drapery folds. Those drapery folds have a little bit more mass to them. But the pose is the same. The sloped, rounded shoulders are the same. The rounded head is the same. But there is this fundamental difference. You walk into a darkened hall, candles or oil lamps are burning, and what do you see? You see light reflecting off the eyes of the Buddha, Amida, the Lord of the Western Paradise, and you engage that statue in a very, very different way. This is a kind of revolutionary change in Buddhist imagery. Here we can see the image itself. We can see the image with its attendants. The attendants have rock crystal eyes. And when we look at the attendants, we know that this anonymous sculptor is doing something else as well, because the attendant bodhisattvas with a pendant leg are popular only in the 8th century. So we know that this sculptor is not only coming up with a new idea, but we know that the sculptor is modeling at least the attendant bodhisattvas on images that were made in the 8th century as well. Further evidence, I think, that this is a part of this made by this group of Nara sculptors that becomes the Kei school. Kokei's earliest extant work, which dates from 1177, uses rock crystal eyes. And so we know that Kokei learns this technique well before he is entrusted with the reconstruction of the South Octagonal Hall at Kofukuji. And to give you some sense of how the technique works, these are not solid blocks of wood. These are blocks of wood that are in multiple pieces that are joined together. And what Kokei does in small statues is he takes a block of wood, splits it in half, hollows out the interior, and then carves the exterior form of his image. And so it means that he can work the inside of the image as well as working the outside of the image. It means the inside of the image is hollow, and so if one wants to inlay something in the eyes, one can figure out where the eye holes are going to be, carve the eye holes out, and what the sculptors did was they took a piece of rock crystal that really functioned like a lens, painted a pupil on that piece of rock crystal, covered the backing either with paper or cotton, and then held it in place, as you can see in this diagram, with a piece of wood secured either with wooden nails or secured with paste made out of lacquer. Totally changing the nature of a Buddha image. So here we have this group of sculptors working in a new style. Here we have this group of sculptors who have been given the responsibility to rebuild this temple, and they do so with great passion. And they implement their ideas in a variety of different ways. The East Image Hall is given over to the Kei school. And the East Image Hall, remember, was founded by Emperor Shomu in 724 and completed in 726 for the memory or to help an empress get better. So its main image was an image of the healing Buddha. But in that hall also were images that were essential to certain rituals at Kofukuji. And I'm no expert on these rituals, but the rituals involve, among other things, a ceremony dedicated to the figure that we see on the screen on the right-hand side, an imaginary or legendary Indian layperson who is said to have had a better understanding of Buddhism than bodhisattvas, essentially a better understanding of Buddhism than anyone. And we have someone who really knows what is going on here in the audience. So I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But Vimalakirti, the person who we see on the screen on the right-hand side, was challenging all the historical Buddha's disciples to a debate. And they refused to debate with him. And finally, the Bodhisattva of wisdom came to debate with him. And Vimalakirti suggests that the Bodhisattva of wisdom, who we see on the screen on the left-hand side, he debate first. And so he gives this profound explanation of Buddhist teachings. And when Vimalakirti is asked to speak, Vimalakirti says nothing because, of course, the Buddha's teachings are indescribable. The Buddha's teachings are so profound that you cannot describe them in words. And Vimalakirti becomes, he sort of wins the debate. This becomes a very popular story in Japanese Buddhism, and it becomes part of Kofukuji. And so we have these statues replaced between 1196 and the beginning of the 13th century at Kofukuji. And we have members of the Kei school using these new naturalistic techniques in the treatment of the drapery, combining naturalism in drapery with rock crystal eyes, with more stylized forms. All of these characteristics make themselves manifest in these statues. So Vimalakirti is shown speaking, or at least with his mouth open. Vimalakirti is shown as a layperson with a cloth on his head. Vimalakirti looks out at us with eyes that reflect light. And these sculptors continue to refurbish the temples. They spend the first 2 decades of the 13th century refurbishing the temples. The healing Buddha is attended by 12 divine protectors. And so the Kei school sculptors, we don't know who makes these divine protectors, but the healing Buddha's 12 vows are represented by these divine protectors. And here we see them, again, taking this interest in pose, taking this interest in naturalism, and applying it to a different category of deity. And these statues were brightly polychromed, and the bright polychrome from the 13th century remains on these statues today, along with much of their gilding. The East Main Hall needed new images of Bonten and Taishakuten. And those images seem to have been completed sometime before 1210, and we see those images here on the screen. What I think is particularly interesting is that if we look at the statue in the Asian Art Museum, I think in places we see a 13th century sculptor looking to the 8th century statue for his model. So we can make this story even more complicated, or make it even more interesting if you're someone like me. We have an 8th century statue that is saved. We have a 13th century statue that is modeled after it. We have a statue that eventually gets damaged, is then reconstructed based on other 8th century prototypes. I think you get a sense of this sort of cross-fertilization among artists over time who look to precedents to make images. And so I'm pretty certain that if we look at the way the folds are on the drapery, if we look at the hem on the image on the left-hand side, we have an artist who was probably looking at an image, looking at the image on the right-hand side, or certainly looking at drawings of images that are very similar to it. And the same thing is true here with the Bonten as well. The West Main Hall was rebuilt. And we assume that the statues in the Asian Art Museum, the 10 great disciples of the Buddha, were reinstalled in the West Main Hall as well. When that statue burned in 1717, while the lacquer statues were saved, the main image of the historical Buddha was badly damaged, and all that was saved of it was its head and its hands. But we see the head of the replaced image of this historical Buddha here on the screen. So we get a sense of intense artistic activity. The West Main Hall needed guardian figures. And so the sculptor Ryuto Key carves guardian figures for the West Main Hall. And I think here you can see Ryuto Key using these naturalistic characteristics, musculature, ferocious expressions, rock crystal eyes to astonishing effect. But these sculptors weren't always serious artists all the time either. So in the case of these two images, we have one of Unkei's disciples, or his sons, named Koben, creating two lantern-bearing demons for the West Main Hall. These are called Ryuto Key, or the dragon, or the one on the right is called Ryuto Key, the dragon lantern bearer, and Tentoki here on the left-hand side. And I think you get a great sense of humor with these images, particularly in Ryuto Key. If you look at Ryuto Key, imagine this demonic figure. He's holding a lantern on top of his head. He's looking up. He's worried whether it is going to tip off. This is a very different attitude towards Buddhist imagery than we have seen before. The sculptor uses cut metal for his gigantic eyebrows, and the dragon that is around his neck has rock crystal for its eyes as well. And so we begin to see variety, we begin to see an astonishing kind of imagination filtered through iconography, but also filtered through this passion for restoring the temples. Between 1208 and 1212, Unkei, so the direct disciple of Kokei, is given the task of refurbishing the North Octagonal Hall. And in the North Octagonal Hall, he makes a carved wooden image of the Buddha of the future, Maitreya. This image he chooses not to use rock crystal for the eyes. So we see a relatively standard image of a seated Buddha. But part of the original group of statues in the North Octagonal Hall, I'm going to skip over that for a moment. Part of the original statues in the North Octagonal Hall were two imaginary Indian prelates, whose Indian name are Vasubandhu and Asanga, or Muchaku Sesshin in Japanese. And here we see Unkei, I think, really pushing the naturalism into to its sort of perhaps most effective. We see two life-size standing portraits of Buddhist monks. We see an artist who is able to carve wood and make that carved wood have the appearance of actual cloth. We have an artist who is able to use the rock crystal eyes, is able to figure the face to give us even a greater degree than his father, and I think even a greater degree than the sculptors of the 8th century, the presence of a real person standing in front of us. If we look at the creases of the face, if we look at the planes of the cheeks, one thing that you will notice about this image is that no human face is exactly the same. There is no perfect left-right symmetry. Unkei understands that. The eyes are slightly different. The cheeks are slightly different as well. And he captures that quality in these statues. When the image of Maitreya was commissioned, inside that image was placed this object. And one of the things that happens in the 13th century is because the images are hollow, people start placing dedicatory objects inside images. They put in relics of the historical Buddha, and they put in an object like this that is meant to be, it is associated with the disk of the sun and the moon. It is meant to be a kind of power center for the sacred energy that an image can emanate from an image. And so we see new sort of ritual practices associated with the commissioning of images, as well. I'm going to end the discussion of Kofukuji just by saying that this is, again, I want to emphasize this idea that this is a living monastic institution. And Kofukuji at the moment is rebuilding its main hall. And I was fortunate enough to be taken up to see part of that reconstruction. And so Kofukuji is going to look like a very different place in the next few years when this new main hall is completed. So the statues in the Asian Art Museum are part of a living tradition. They're images with a history. They're images that we can relate to the reconstruction of the temple. They're images that we can document at multiple times during the temple's history. If you will bear with me for just a second, I just want to show you a few other images of 13th century Buddhist sculpture that I think give a sense of why this world is so absolutely fascinating, and things that perhaps one might not know about Buddhist imagery if you didn't sort of probe the temples of Japan. First, I want to show you a statue that was sold at Christie's in 2008. A statue that is associated with Unkei, a statue that, because it is not officially signed, was able to be exported from Japan and was able to be put on auction. What we see is a seated image of a Buddha that is known as the Buddha of the Cosmos. His name in Japanese is Dainichi. And it is clearly a beautiful image. It has rock crystal eyes. It has some of the naturalistic qualities of a Buddhist sculpture. But before it was put on sale, the auction house x-rayed the image. And when the x-rays were processed, it was discovered that inside this image were put a number of dedicatory objects. If you look very carefully, we can see a piece of wood running from the base of the interior all the way up into the head. If we look carefully, we can see one of those hemispheres of rock crystal on top of a lotus, and we can see a reliquary here as well. Everything that is white are pieces of metal that are used to hold the image together. What is equally fascinating is if we follow the contours of the cavity of this image and we get up to the ears, we can see that the artist of this image, and I am completely certain that the artist of this image is Unkei, carved into the interior cavity. So first of all, we have an image that looks out at us that we look at with these reflective eyes. But we have an image that hears us as well. These are not ears that just stop with a carved piece of wood. These are ears that open into the interior cavity of the statue. Again, reflecting a different kind of conceptualization of the image. If we probe further and look at these objects in the interior, and we look very carefully at the x-rays and compare them to other objects that we know that we associate with Unkei, what we are probably looking at in the center of this image is a memorial plaque. And a little bit of historical excavation has allowed a group of us to conclude that this image was commissioned by a warlord in eastern Japan on the occasion of his two sons dying from some kind of pestilence between 1191 and 1194. And we're pretty certain that written on that object in the interior are the circumstances of the creation of this image. If we look a little bit more closely, if we blow up the X-ray photograph, we can see a 5-element pagoda, and inside that 5-element pagoda is a relic, a piece that was understood to be part of the historical Buddha, an object that then connects this image with the historical Buddha who lived back in ancient India. And if we look at the other object, we're pretty certain that it is similar to that object that I showed you just a moment ago, a hemispherical piece of rock crystal on top of a lotus dais. This idea that everyone has in them something that embodies the potential of enlightenment, that the potential of one's spirituality is inside one. It takes the shape of a disk of the sun or the moon, and that it is sort of like the emanating generative force of any individual's enlightenment. That's put inside this statue as well, as we see here on the screen, an object not unlike the one that I just showed you. So and here you can see a reliquary similar to the one that's inside this statue, because the statue has not been opened up. So we have an image that is a container. We have an image that is activated. We have an image that somehow embodies more than just its exterior form. And this is yet something else that we can study with new technology. Laura Allen tells me that there are X-ray photographs of the statues in the Asian Art Museum. And looking inside statues tells us a lot of fascinating things. I'm going to show you two other statues very quickly. This is another statue carved by Kaikei at a temple called Jodoji outside of the modern-day city of Kobe. And this is a statue in a hall that, unlike many halls in Japan, has windows or doors opening to the back. It's an image of the Lord of the Western Paradise, and the Lord of the Western Paradise is said to live in the West, and he comes down from the West to provide salvation for sentient beings. This is a hall that was constructed by the monk who rebuilt Todaiji, collaborating with Kaikei, and they reconstructed it in such a way that when the sun sets, the setting sun comes into the hall, and the image is bathed in the light of the setting sun. So we have the statues here on the screen on the left-hand side, but if one goes and visits this hall at the right time of day, but particularly at the right season, then the image is lit from behind by natural light. And you can imagine a devotee at the end of the 12th century, when this image was completed in 1192, in this hall with these monumental statues of Amida in front of them, and the images become increasingly activated by natural light. So these images are understood in a variety of different ways of being more than just inanimate objects. They're viewed as being active intercessors in the world in which we exist. And so you can get, these are not my photographs. My teacher took these photographs and gave them to me. But I think you get a sense that this is then an image that is coming down. Finally, we have images that can be dressed. If you think that every time this image is dressed, it wears its robes in a slightly different way, sewn robes, I think you get a sense that, yet again, sculptors collaborating with theologians, patrons collaborating with theologians and sculptors, coming up with solutions of new ways to think about Buddhist deities. The Kamakura period in particular, and the Keisuke sculptors especially, make these innovations. And I just wanted to give you, outside of sort of the main theme of today's talk, of the Bonten and Taishakuten statues, Kofukuji and Kofukuji's reconstruction, I just wanted to give you a little bit of flavor of images in situ, what it means to go and find statues, see statues in situ, or figuring out new ways to think about statues through new technologies that allow us even greater insight into religious practice in Japan. It's something that has animated me for a very long time. It continues to animate me. I hope it's something that will animate you and make you want to go look at these statues in situ as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.